we're looking at using encryption to provide confidentiality. Confidentiality is we want to send a message to someone. We only want them to be able to read that message. We don't want others who can intercept the message across the communication channel. We don't want them to be able to read the contents of that message. So what we do is we encrypt the message before we send it, and we send the encrypted version. And the notation we've introduced, we say the original message is the plain text, the encrypted form is the ciphertext. We send the ciphertext, the receiver decrypts it, and we use keys to do the encryption. The source encrypts using a key at their side, and then they send the ciphertext to the receiver decrypts, and the approach we're looking at, the receiver uses the same key to decrypt. So both sides use the same key. That key must be kept secret. Since both sides use the same key, we call it symmetric key encryption. There's symmetry amongst the keys on both sides. So that's our model. Source takes some plain text, encrypts using some algorithm, and mathematically we can think of it's a function. Encryption is a function. It takes two inputs, the plain text and a shared secret key K, and we apply that function or algorithm. Sometimes we simply call it a cipher, but it's just a function that takes two inputs and returns some output, which we call the ciphertext or C. We send the ciphertext. The receiver uses another function, the decryption function, and again takes two inputs, the same key in this case, the same key K, and the ciphertext as input, and produces, if all goes well, the plain text as output. We don't look at the details of how these functions work. What we want to arrive at is what are the properties, or what can we assume about these functions when we use them correctly, when we use strong encryption algorithms. We're assuming so far that the key is secret, known only by the source and destination, not by others. If someone else knows the key, then it's not a secret, so we cannot call it a secret key. So that's an assumption that the key is kept secret, and that the algorithms, what we'll say, are strong, they are secure. And as we go through, we'll see some examples of what we mean by that. Many ciphers, the algorithms, the encryption and decryption algorithm, we call the ciphers. They can be broken into two types, block ciphers and stream ciphers. A cipher doesn't encrypt an entire file at once. What the algorithms are designed to do, to make them secure and to perform well, they're designed to encrypt a small piece of information at a time. Small is usually multiple bytes, like 64 bytes. Actually 64 bits, so 8 or 16 bytes is the common size, or even smaller, down to 1 bit or 1 byte. And I'll show you some examples. But there are two variations of ciphers. One which are were originally designed to encrypt large pieces of information like files, and they were called block ciphers. And block ciphers usually take your file, or the data you want to encrypt, and break it into blocks of either 64 bits or 128 bits. They are common block sizes. So if I have my 1 megabyte file, the cipher doesn't encrypt it all at once. You think that the software splits it into smaller blocks, encrypts the first block, and then separately encrypts the second block, and then the third block, and so on. The way that it combines the encryption of those blocks, there are some special modes to do that. We'll see some listed, but important thing for you to notice, we don't encrypt the entire file at once. The algorithms apply in blocks. Some ciphers were designed to operate on larger blocks and designed to be work well on files. They were not very fast in the original, well, I guess many years ago. They were not so fast in that it's okay to encrypt a file on your disk. Maybe it takes a few seconds. But if you want to encrypt something in real time, For example, I'm speaking on my mobile phone, and as I speak, my voice needs to be sent very quickly with very small delay to the other person on their phone. The delay in the order of milliseconds, tens of or maybe hundreds of milliseconds. If the delay is too long when we talk, then it's very hard to have a conversation. In such applications, if we want to encrypt that voice before we send it, and the encryption takes a long time, then it means that the voice application will not work well, because there'll be a large delay to not just send the voice, but to also encrypt the voice. So some applications, the block ciphers were not fast enough. So the other approach were called stream ciphers, where they encrypt either 1 byte or even 1 bit at a time. And they use different designs to do stream ciphers. Often they use exclusive OR. You all know XOR. We'll see some, maybe an example later, but use exclusive OR the data with a random key to do encryption. The idea was to come up with faster algorithms, but there may be some limitations in some cases of how they can be used. Maybe the design of the algorithm was such that they weren't as secure in some cases. Some flaws have been found in some stream ciphers. So there are 2 different types of ciphers, block and stream ciphers. We're going to give some examples of each, but mainly block ciphers, and show examples. Nowadays, because of some hardware advancements and the algorithm advancements, sometimes there's not much difference in performance between block and stream ciphers. So sometimes it's not so clear. We can use block ciphers to encrypt in real time. So the next few slides give examples of some block ciphers, and what I want you to remember from this course is some of their names, which ones are good, maybe some of the flaws, but not how they are designed in detail. We will not get into that. So I'll quickly present some of them, a little bit of history with some of them, and a short comparison. But there are many more than what I list here, than what I can present. One of the main block ciphers, which was the first one that became widely used and probably still influence other ciphers, is called the Data Encryption Standard, DES. Designed in the 1970s, so about 40 years ago, and it became a standard in the US. And what that meant is it became a standard for the US government to use, and therefore many companies that deal with the US government and others also use this for encryption of data. And it became used widely in the world, DES. It operated on blocks of 64 bits. So you have a large file to encrypt with DES. What it does is it splits, or the software would split that file into chunks of 64 bits, encrypt 64 bits, get some ciphertext, encrypt the next 64 bits with DES, get some ciphertext. It uses a key length of 64 bits as well, but it turned out that the key of those 64 bits, only 8 of those bits were not really used for security purposes. They were used for a parity check on the rest of the bits in the key. When we look at brute force attacks, we'll see that the length of the key is important. With DES, the length of the key was 64 bits. From a security perspective, only 56 bits were relevant. So the effective strength comes down to 56. Last week I gave some quick examples about a Caesar cipher and a rail fence cipher, and the point of those examples were to say that the 2 core operations of most ciphers we see are substitutions, replace something with something else, and transpositions or permutations, rearrange the plain text. And in fact, DES uses a combination of permutations and substitutions, but it doesn't just do it once, it does many permutations and substitutions and then repeats it all again, and then repeats it again, and it repeats 16 times. with the idea that the more you mix things up, the more secure the ciphertext will be. There are other good things about the design of DES. It was widely used. The algorithm itself is considered secure. There were some questions about it, but most people consider it's a good, well-designed algorithm, except for one thing. The key length that is used is too small. 56 bits makes it possible for people to design hardware and even nowadays use software to decrypt, trying all possible keys to find the plaintext given some ciphertext. They can do brute force attacks if it's a 56-bit key. That's just to highlight that it's not something simple we can go through in one lecture. If you sit through my other course, we go through this in maybe 2 or 3 lectures of how DES works, but not here. 56-bit key, let's look at that. I know you're all good at statistics, probability, and binary numbers. But let's just summarize the idea. Let's say we have a cipher. Some of the concepts we're talking about. Let's say I have a file, and it's 10,000 bytes. Right? I want to encrypt the file. 10,000 bytes. Well, we use a cipher to encrypt that, not DES. Let's consider a simplified example. Let's say I have a cipher. Let's call it Steve's Great Cipher. Okay, that's the name of the cipher. And what that cipher does is it takes a 3-bit key, a 3-bit secret key, and encrypts 10-bit blocks. Just some simple numbers that we can use for example, just to illustrate. So the concept here is that when we have our 10,000 bytes in the file, or 80,000 bits we want to encrypt, we can think, we take that file. Don't worry about SGC, it's just my fake name of the cipher. Okay. What we do is we take the file and split it. We can say the first 10 bits, so the first part of the file will be encrypted. Maybe I'll do that the wrong way. Try it slightly different. We take the first part of the file, we encrypt it, we use a key K, and we get some ciphertext as output. Where this is 10 bits, and this is also 10 bits, and this is 3 bits. Just for our simplified example, to illustrate that we don't encrypt all 80,000 bits at once. We apply our cipher on a block, in this example 10 bits. We encrypt the first 10 bits of the file, we get 10 bits of ciphertext out, and then in the naive approach, or the simplest approach, we take the next 10 bits of the file, we encrypt the second chunk of the file, the second block, using the same key, and we get another ciphertext as output. And we keep going until we do all 80,000 bits of our file. So with 10 bits per block, we have 8,000 blocks, 80,000 bits, 10 bits per block, 8,000 blocks to encrypt. So we can think 8,000 blocks of plain text of the file that are encrypted, and as an output we get 8,000 ciphertext blocks of the same size. When we encrypt, the plain text length and the cipher text length are the same, always the same. 10 bits in, 10 bits out. The key may not be the same, but the plain text and ciphertext are. So we keep doing that. I will not draw it. And a naive approach is simply then the ciphertext for that entire file is just the concatenation of the different blocks. That is C1 followed by C2 followed by C3 and so on. So if the file was 10,000 bytes, after we do that, we keep going for all the, 8,000 blocks in total. And as an output, the final ciphertext is just the first chunk followed by the second chunk followed by, at the end, the 8,000th chunk. So this is just highlighting the point we operate on blocks. The algorithms are designed to be secure and perform well for fixed size blocks. Now, the way that we combine these blocks together, and in fact we do each block at a time, there are different ways. This one turns out not to be good, just to combine it directly. There are other ways called modes of operation. I'll show you some slides that illustrate different approaches for that. We don't need to know how and why, but when we use some software, we'll see the names of the different ways to combine the chunks together. This is the simple approach, but there are other better approaches. When we look at analyzing ciphers, we usually focus on a single encryption, not the encryption across multiple blocks, but just look at a single block. Now, consider an attacker. An attacker wants to, if they intercept some ciphertext, they know the ciphertext, they know the algorithm, they want to find the plain text and or the key. So an attacker in this case what do they know? They know the ciphertext. They know the algorithm, the cipher. That's the assumption we make with respect to the attacker. They know what the ciphertext is, and they know what algorithm was used to encrypt. They know the decryption algorithm. They want to find the key or the plain text. What they have as an option to do is two types of attacks. The first one is what we call a brute force, and we've had some comments on that last lecture, but the brute force attack, and it's listed on the slides, try all possible keys, with the idea that if I have some ciphertext and I decrypt that ciphertext with a key, I will get some potential plain text. And if I try all the possible keys, then one of those potential plain text values will be the correct one, because one of the keys is the correct one. And for this attack to work, that the attacker can recognize which one is the correct plain text and therefore the correct key. So the brute force attack involves the attacker trying all possible keys. So what they would do in this case they would, let's say they know the ciphertext, and now we'll just focus on a single block. So they take the known ciphertext block and they decrypt using their algorithm. The cipher has the encrypt mode and the decrypt mode. Sometimes they are almost the same. And they decrypt with a key, I'll denote key 1, and they get some plaintext value, P1. Where the first value of key 1 they may try, let's say they try key 1, which is equal to, with a 3-bit value, 0, 0, 0. And when they decrypt, they get plaintext P1, whatever the value is. I haven't shown the value of the ciphertext and plaintext, but let's denote it as P1. The potential plaintext, the first potential plaintext. Now, the brute force attack involves the attacker checking, is this potential plaintext correct? Is it the original plaintext that the original user encrypted, the first part of the file? And we assume that they have a way to know if it's correct or not. And in practice, usually it's quite easy to know. The concept is, if I decrypt some ciphertext and I get a file, usually I can recognize whether it's the correct file or not. If the file was a text document in English, then it would be a set of words in English, and I'd recognize that. If it was the wrong plaintext, then it would be random characters. So there'll be no structure. Similarly, if the file was an image, a photo that I encrypted, if I decrypt it and I see an image that I can observe, I know, right, that's probably the correct plaintext. But if I see just random or noise on the image, then I assume that was the wrong plaintext and therefore the wrong key. So with most data that we are encrypting, when we decrypt using the correct key, we will get plaintext we can recognize. When we decrypt with the wrong key, we will get plaintext which we recognize as being wrong. And that's an assumption in our brute force attack, and an assumption in practice which usually holds. So, with respect to our small example here, what the attacker does is decrypts the ciphertext with a potential key. If the plaintext makes sense, they've found the key. If the plaintext doesn't make sense, then they try the next key. Let's say 001, they decrypt the same ciphertext using the next possible key and they get a different plaintext. If this one makes sense, if they recognize it's the correct one, they've found the key. If not, they keep going. What's the worst case in this example in terms of the number of keys that the attacker needs to try? Until they find the correct plaintext, what's the worst case number of attempts of decrypting they need to try? Tell me the answer. Louder? Not 2 to the power of something, but what's the answer? How many keys do they need to try? Oh well, if no one's going to yell it out, we'll write them all down. We've got a 3-bit key, we try this one, let's say we're unlucky and the plaintext is not correct. We try the next one. That was unlucky, we got plaintext that was not correct, we keep trying. We know that the algorithm only uses a 3-bit key, so in the worst case, we have to try 8 times, try 8 different keys. And one of those 8 must be the correct key that the original user used, and we must give a correct plaintext. So the worst case from the attacker's perspective is to try all 8 keys when we have a 3-bit key. What's the best case? You're very lucky. How many attempts do you need to make to find the correct key, 1 attempt if you're lucky. The first one you try is it. All right, so that's the best case, 1. Worst case, all of them. Average case, sometimes we are lucky and get it in 1 attempt. Sometimes it takes 2 attempts. Sometimes 3 attempts. It depends on what key the user chose. And if they chose a random key, then we can say on average the number of attempts we take is half of the key space. So in this, the best case was 1 attempt. The worst case would be 8. The average case, that is, if we did it once, an attack, where the user chose a random key and then we did another attack on another key and keep doing that many times, on average, it'll take 4 attempts. Half of the worst case. Because sometimes it takes 8 attempts, sometimes 1, sometimes 7, sometimes 2. If we average all those values, it becomes 4. There's a little bit of an approximation there, but that will do us for our analysis of key space. And that's what we're interested in. This is a small example where we used a 3-bit key. Let's consider DES, which uses a 56-bit key. It actually has a 64-bit key, but only 56 are used in the encryption. So the attacker only needs to guess 56 of the keys, 56 of the bits. Worst case from a brute force attack, with a 56-bit key, 2 to the power of 56. Average case, the number of attempts that we'd need to take is half of that, 2 to the power of 56 divided by 2, which is actually 2 to the power of 55. Not much difference, in fact. The order of magnitude is about the same. So there's not much difference in practice between average and worst case, because those numbers are quite large. In other words, if the worst case took me 1,000 years, then the average case takes me 500 years. Both of them are too long. And we'll see some numbers, how long they would take. Or, if the worst case took me 1 day, then the average case would take me half a day. Both of them are easy to do an attack on. So sometimes we'll list the worst case performance, sometimes the average case performance. So that's the concept of a brute force attack. Try all keys. And if we can try all keys, then we'll eventually find the correct one and the cipher can be broken. So the way to prevent a brute force attack, make sure that the algorithm uses a key which is large, such that if the attacker needs to try all keys, it would take too long. So the key length is an important characteristic of a cipher. Any questions before we return to the slides? Look at a couple more example ciphers and then see how long a brute force attack takes. Okay? If your key is 3 bits, there are 8 keys. If you want to try them all, you need 8 attempts. If your key is 56 bits, you need 2 to the power of 56 attempts. Of course, the question you should be asking is how long does it take to make 2 to the power of 56 attempts? We'll talk about that shortly. So how long would it take my computer to try a DES decryption 2 to the power of 56 times? We'll give some numbers. But before that, so DES, the algorithm was considered good. There were many implementations at the time, but the key size was considered too short. So make it larger. And another cipher was called triple DES, written as 3 DES sometimes. And that used DES, but 3 times. And each time we encrypted, in fact, there was a variation where we encrypt, decrypt, encrypt, but that's not so important. We use a different key. That is, we take our plaintext, apply DES using key 1 of 64 bits, effective length 56, take the output, encrypt, although it says decrypt here, which it did in practice, it could also be encrypt, with a different key. Another 64-bit key, and then again with another 64-bit key. Now the attacker must guess a key which is made up of 3 parts, K1, K2, K3. It's no longer 64 bits, it's 3 times 64 bits long. So that's the idea of triple DES. Extend the key length but use the same algorithm. And using the same algorithm means they could make use of the same software, the same hardware to encrypt things. And there are a few variations on triple DES. Sometimes they use 3 different keys, sometimes they use 2 different keys, K1, K2, K1. So there's the effective length of the key of DES is 56 bits. There was a version of triple DES that doubled that to 112 bits, and there was another version that tripled it, so that the actual length up to 168 bits, the effective length, so 3 times 56 there. So a brute force attack against a 168-bit key requires an attacker to do 2 to the power of 168 different operations. We'll look at the numbers of how long that will take shortly. So triple DES is still today considered secure and still used in some cases. The problem with triple DES, it's currently quite slow compared to other algorithms. It's 3 times slower than DES, because what it does is just applies DES 3 times. So with security we care about, with cryptography we care about having an algorithm which is secure, but also one is convenient to use. And one measure of convenience is performance, how fast it takes to, how fast we can encrypt something. So we can't just extend the key length because it may compromise the performance. So triple DES is around, and if you use some encryption software, you may see it as an option. But in the 1990s, the standards organization wanted to design a newer algorithm which wanted to be secure and wanted to perform very well in a number of different conditions. And it was held as a competition, and a number of researchers submitted entries. Eventually one was chosen, and it was called the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES. And this is widely used today. Probably when you use some applications on the internet or you use disk encryption on your computer, it may be using AES. It's today considered secure, so there are no known significant weaknesses in the algorithm. It used a block size of 128 bits, and it had options for different key lengths. Not just one value, but you can choose a key length of 128 bits, 192 or 256 bits. If you untrustworthy of attackers, and you will see the numbers shortly, but if you want to really future-proof your encryption, you would use the longer key length. But again, shorter key, less secure in theory, so use a longer key. The problem with a longer key is that the encryption takes more time. It degrades the performance. AES is considered maybe the practical standard to be used today. If you're going to encrypt files, even encrypt data in real time, AES is a strong contender to choose. Some systems that you use would use AES, so when you have the encryption enabled on Wi-Fi, one of the options is to use AES. When you use disk encryption on your operating system, so in Windows, in FileVault is one of the ones for OS X and on Linux, they all use AES by default. Some of the internet applications, when they encrypt, one of the options and a common one to use now is AES to encrypt. It's considered secure and reasonably fast. It performs well. And there are others. And this slide just lists some of the names of others, the years when they were released, and the block length and the key length. All right, they have different combinations. Blowfish, Twofish, Serpent, Idea, RC5, RC6, and others. Okay, but if you need to choose one today, then you'd probably choose AES, unless you had very special case requirements. Questions on the ciphers so far? You may have questions. How does AES work? We will not go through that in this course. You can read up about that in the course textbook or visit my other lecture one day. Let's come back to brute force attacks. We said, let's put some numbers to it now. With DES, 56-bit key, how long would a brute force attacker take? Well, worst case, we need to decrypt 2 to the power of 56 times. Then the question is, how long does it take to decrypt one time with DES? How many seconds? If we know that, then we can work out how long would it take to do a brute force attack. And then same with AES, with the 128-bit key or a 256-bit key. Where do we get? So brute force attacks, we'll come back to those summary of principles in a moment. Brute force attack, try all keys in the key space. The key space is the set of all possible keys. And with a binary key of k bits length, the key space is 2 to the power of k. We care about how long does it take in time, but in practice, the time will depend not just on the key length, but on how fast your computer is, because it's your computer doing the decryption. And how fast your computer is depends on many factors. It depends upon the hardware and the software that's running. And it varies a lot. My mobile phone to decrypt is much slower than my laptop, which is much slower than my desktop, which is much slower than a supercomputer. So it varies amongst different systems and even with different software. So often when cryptographers compare algorithms, they simply look at the key length or the number of operations, not the actual time. But let's try and put some numbers to it. We'll do it in different ways, some theoretical numbers. What this table shows is, on the first column, it gives some possible key lengths. For example, if we use a 56-bit key, or a 128-bit key, or 256. And then the next column is the key space. With a 56-bit key, we know quite simply there are 2 to the power of 56 possible keys. an attacker must, in the worst case, try all 2 to the power of 56 possible keys. How many is that? Let's get our calculator out. DES uses 56-bit key. 2 to the power of 56 is about 7 by 10 to the power of 16 keys. So that's how many we need to try. Then the question is, how fast is a computer to try those keys? And what I give in the next 3 columns are some theoretical speeds. What if we had a computer that could do 1 billion decrypts per second? 10 to the power of 9 is 1 billion. Then it takes 10 to the power of 16 operations divided by our 10 to the power of 9 per second. So we can do 1 billion per second. So that's the number of seconds it would take to do the brute force attack. How many minutes? Divide by 60. How many hours? Divide by 60. How many days? Divide by 24. That's how I arrive at the 833. It should be 834 days. That is, if we do a brute force attack on DES and our computer can do 1 billion decrypts per second, then it'll take us a couple of years, almost 3 years. Now, what if I get a faster computer? Or what if I get access to all of the computers in SIT? Over the weekend, I run my brute force attack using every computer, all the lab computers and so on, maybe 1,000 computers, and do it in parallel. Well, I effectively increase my speed by a factor of 1,000. And the next column shows if I can do 10 to the power of 12 decrypts per second, 1,000 times faster, then it would take 1,000 times less time, 20 hours. What if I could go even faster? Maybe I'm a government, and my government has access to thousands, tens of thousands of computers, many supercomputers, and can do an attack at the same time, and has dedicated hardware built for decrypting. Maybe it goes up to 10 to the power of 15 per second. Then you see with DES, it takes seconds to defeat the data encryption standard. Even with 10 to the power of 12, it may take less than 1 day. That's why we say DES, the key length is too small. A brute force attack is possible. How fast is your computer? Can it do 10 to the power of 9, 10 to the power of 12, or 10 to the power of 15? Have a guess. How many decrypt operations do you think your phone, your laptop, or home PC may do? Which one of those 3 would it be close to? Do you want to try on your laptop? Well, let's try. We'll try on my laptop. We'll do some decrypt and see how fast my laptop is with decrypting DES to see, is it 10 to the power of 9, 10 to the power of 12, or 15, approximately. And I used it briefly last week, and we'll use it through the course. We're going to use just some open source software that implements many encryption algorithms. And it's used for many other applications called OpenSSL. And the useful thing for this course is that it implements the algorithms that we commonly use, like DES and AES. And the software also does a speed test for me. There's an operation that will try to decrypt something, just random messages, as fast as possible, and then report how fast or how many it could do per second. So I'll run an OpenSSL speed test. And let's run it for DES. It'll take a minute or so. What's going to happen when I press enter is that the software will just choose some random plain text of different sizes, encrypt them for as many as possible for 3 seconds, and record how many it could do. And it does it under a few different conditions, which we'll describe. It's doing some DES encryptions. My computer's running, and it does in batch of 3 seconds. It did 9,500,000 in the first 3 seconds. And it's doing for different input sizes. All right, so first time it runs for 16 bytes at a time. Next one 64. And now it's doing it for triple DES. The first one was normal DES. This one is actually triple DES. The notation there. It's running, and now maybe the thing of importance, it gives me some summary results at the end. So we'll just use them. Well, actually, we can use the first one to explain. Let's look at just the first line. It was doing DES encryptions, and it turns out encryptions and decryptions, so effectively the same with DES. It took random 16 bytes of plain text and encrypted 16 bytes at a time, and it counted. And in 3 seconds, it did 9.5 million operations in 3 seconds. So in 1 second, it can do 1/3 of that. About 3 million, 3.2 million decrypts per second. So my computer was doing about 3 million operations per second. Not 3 billion, our 10 to the power of 9, but maybe about 10 to the power of 6. So now there are other cases, it varies a bit in different conditions, but approximately we can say, in terms of this table, my computer is not 10 to the power of 9, it's 10 to the power of 6. It's 1,000 times slower than this. So it wouldn't take my computer 833 days, it would take 833,000 days to break DES. So my computer's not so good at breaking DES. But it turns out if you can build dedicated hardware just for breaking DES, it's not so bad, and I'll show some other examples shortly. While I have the speed test software running, we have the results here. Another result, it's hard to see at the moment, but with DES, this summarizes the speeds. The way to interpret this number, it can do DES with my laptop can encrypt about 55 megabytes per second. I have a lot of data to encrypt. This is saying I can encrypt at about 55 megabytes per second. So that's one measure of performance from the other perspective. Remember this number, 9.5 million. Triple DES, 3 million, or almost 4 million. Triple DES is slower than normal DES. Almost 3 times slower, not quite. Let's try it with AES, the newer algorithm. And there are different modes and different key lengths with AES. I'll choose the 128-bit key length just to save some time. Now doing a speed test on AES with a 128-bit key. DES uses 56 bits. Maybe the first number here, 15 million operations per second. So with AES we get about 15 million, with DES about 9.5 million. Triple DES about 4 million. So AES faster in that case. Or from the other perspective, with AES I can do about 94 megabytes per second. With DES it was about 55 megabytes per second. So AES is almost twice as fast as DES on my laptop. So AES was designed to be fast, and it's faster than DES, even though it's using a longer key. All of these tests are just using the OpenSSL software. What's faster than using software to encrypt? What's faster than using software? Hardware. That is, use the dedicated features of the CPU to encrypt. This is just a software programming running on my computer using the general purpose CPU to encrypt. Nowadays, CPUs have special instructions that are built just to encrypt and decrypt data, and especially for AES. So my Intel CPU has, so you know the instructions, the assembly instructions of your CPU, one of them is an AES operation. So it's been built into the CPU just to do encryption and decryption fast. And in fact, I can tell OpenSSL to use that. Before I forget the numbers, I'll write them down. Approximately, we got, with DES, we got about 9.5 million per 3 seconds. With triple DES, we got about 4.8, I think it was, million per 3 seconds. With AES, in software, we got about 15.5 million per 3 seconds. Now I'm going to do AES in hardware. That is, I'm going to use the special instructions inbuilt on my Intel CPU to do the test and see if that's faster. Don't look at my password. First, let's see what CPU I have so we can compare. My CPU, my laptop's several years old now. An Intel i7, a mobile version, maybe 3 or 4 years old. And lots of details about that. This thing's of interest. The features supported by this CPU, it supports a special set of instructions just for AES. So most recent, the last 4 or 5 years, CPUs have this set of instructions for AES. So now I'm going to use the speed test using the hardware features. And the option to tell it doesn't matter, but that says don't use the software, use the hardware to do an AES test. Let's see how it goes. What do we get? This number. 9 million or no, 92 million. With the hardware encryption, my computer can do 92 million per second, per 3 seconds, or about 550 megabytes per second. $92 million per 3 seconds. You see a big jump in speed here. It's almost 6 times faster than the same algorithm implemented just in software to use the CPU hardware instructions, and 10 times faster than DES. So AES, because it's so widely used, now has hardware support, and many devices can now encrypt using hardware, which makes AES very fast. So that's about 30 million per second. Still, that's only 10 to the power of 7 operations per second. Our example numbers here assumed we could do 10 to the power of 9 per second, but my laptop can do maybe it approaches 10 to the power of 8. So it's getting close to here, but it's still 10 or 100 times slower than this column. In a moment I'll show you some examples of some dedicated hardware for breaking ciphers and see what speeds they get to finish today. Before that, what if we use a 128-bit key, as in AES? 2 to the power of 128 possible keys. If we had access to computers that could do 10 to the power of 15 operations per second, maybe I had 1 million laptops like mine, or 10 million laptops all doing it at the same time, then I could break that in about 10 to the power of 16 years. And note down the bottom, the age of the universe is about 10 to the power of 10 years. That is, to do a brute force attack on AES, I'd have to wait for the universe to end. And I'm not prepared to wait that long. And that means that effectively a 128-bit key is secure. A brute force attack is not possible. So we can see even probably less than 128 bits is still okay. 100 bits, even 80 bits. But with 128 bits, we're safe. Even if we have a government with not 1 million laptops, but 1 billion laptops, 1,000 times more processing power, then it just comes down to 10 to the power of 13 years. And if they have a same number of supercomputers, it still comes down to thousands of years before they can break AES. And if I move up to a 256-bit key, of course it takes even longer. So that's why we say a 128-bit key is secure against a brute force attack. It's not possible in practice. Questions before we have one last example? We started with some theoretical numbers, 10 to the power of 9, to the power of 12 and 15. I showed some examples of my laptop, but laptops are not built to defeat AES or DES. You can actually buy or build hardware specialized to beat or defeat ciphers. So let's look at some of that hardware and see how it works. And I think if you flick forward a few slides, you'll see the separate set of slides that I give some data. It's on the course website, brute force of DES and AES as well, but I think you have it in your handouts. Let me bring it up. And we'll start with some old examples. So first looking at DES. We said with my laptop today it could not break DES. It would take maybe 8,000 days. But in 1998, so almost 20 years ago, the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, so DES was widely used at that stage, or was used in some cases. They built some dedicated hardware. It cost about $250,000 US at that time, and it could do about 80 billion keys per second. So that 10 to the power of 9 keys per second, about 80 times faster than that. And it could essentially defeat DES in a couple of days, a few days. So in 1998, you could build dedicated hardware to defeat DES. So DES was considered insecure even before then. That was just an example of it. You can find more about DeepCrack, that dedicated hardware, on those websites. More recently, but still 10 years ago, some German companies and universities built Copacabana. What they did is that they built some field programmable gate arrays, FPGAs they used, and programmed them just to defeat DES, to do DES decryptions. And so this is the board and these are the FPGAs that are slotted in there. It's from the company. They could do about 400 million operations per second per board, per FPGA. And with a set, they could break desks in about 8 days. But it only cost $10,000 in that case. At about the same time, the normal PC, a Pentium 4 at that time, could do about 2 million keys per second. A normal PC, about 2 million. This hardware could do about 400 million. So that's just an example. If you use specialized hardware, you can go much faster than a normal computer. If you apply those same numbers, everyone knows Moore's law. You may have heard of Moore's law, and it's more complex than I state here, but roughly hardware doubles in performance every 18 months. That's the idea. That is, every 1.5 years, so if I buy a computer today, and in 1.5 years' time, for the same amount of money, I buy a computer, then that future computer will be about 2 times better than my current one. Double in performance every 18 months about. Or, the other way, if I spend 100,000 baht today to buy a computer, which gives some speed, then in 1.5 years I could spend 50,000 baht to get the same power computer, the same speed computer. If it halves in performance, it effectively halves in cost. If we apply that principle, then today, well, this was 2013. I haven't updated for a couple of years, but it would take maybe $300 US to break desks. Maybe today it's down to $100, 3,000 baht, 4,000 baht to buy hardware to break desks. So anyone can do it. That's the point. DES is insecure. What about AES? The same company built hardware dedicated to break AES. The AES 128-bit, they did a brute force attack, again using FPGAs. It cost about $100 per board. They could do about 500 million keys per second. They could do some faster ones with some specialized attacks, almost 1,000 million keys per second. And if you put numbers to that, approximately if you spend $15,000, this is 2013, you could do a brute force attack for $15,000 in 1.7 by 10 to the power of 20 years with this hardware. So a brute force attack, if you spend this amount of money, would take you about 10 to the power of 20 years with dedicated hardware on AES. If you had more money, you could buy 1,000 of these. $15 million, you reduce to 10 to the power of 17 years. If you have $15 billion, you could do it in about 10 to the power of 14 years. Still impossible. If you multiply by 1,000 again, spend even more money, you still can't break AES 128. That's the point there. What if I want to encrypt something today and make sure it's secure 10 years, 15 years in the future? I don't want someone to be able to decrypt it in the future. Well, if we extend maybe 15 years, so 2028, again, the cost halves every 1.5 years. Approximately in 2028, if I have $15 billion to spend on my computers then it will still take 100 billion years to defeat AES 128. So brute force attacks in theory are possible, but very easy to defend against by choosing a key length of 128 bits or larger. Questions before we move Back to our lecture slides. Remember all of those numbers. The quiz will ask you, how much does it cost to break AES? Only joking, you don't need to remember all of them. But be aware that a brute force attack is not possible if we use a large enough key. This is trying to show that. And have an idea of how fast computers are with respect to encryption. They talk normal computers, maybe millions of operations per second, hundreds of millions in some cases. Dedicated computers, even faster. But when you have 2 to the power of 128, it's still no use to do a brute force attack. So where do we get to? What about other attacks? Brute force attacks are the dumb approach. Just try everything. The smarter approach is to try to find some weaknesses in the algorithms, in the ciphers. And that's referred to as cryptanalysis. And there are many different ways to do cryptanalysis, and people try to find weaknesses in the ciphers, in DES, AES, and others. And some are found in theory, but with respect to AES, there are some known attacks on AES. The bi-click attack is one known one. The problem with these known attacks is that they don't reduce the brute force attack time by much, and they require some extra information to work. There is a known attack on AES 128. The normal brute force attack requires 2 to the power of 128 operations. That's the brute force attack, which we know is not possible. This specialized attack requires about 2 to the power of 126 operations. It's 4 times faster. 4 times faster than billions of years doesn't really matter. Okay, so in theory, these known attacks are a little bit faster, but not significant. And they require extra memory or extra data to do those attacks. So in theory, there are attacks, but as far as we know, there are known attacks against AES. Similar with DES, only brute force is possible. So AES is considered secure. So to finish this on symmetric key encryption, we'll go back to one slide to summarize the key principles you should remember. I will not require you to understand how the algorithms work, but when we move on to later topics, we will use the algorithms to implement other security features, and we'll make some assumptions. And some of them are listed here. You have a separate sheet in your handout which lists them all together. So if you go forward a few pages, let's see which page, at the end of the cryptography slides, let me find it, on 107. Page 107, there's something titled Assumptions, and that captures the key assumptions that we're going to use for the rest of the course, cryptographic assumptions and principles. Some of them are presented in the slides like here, others are on that handout. This one, we will not go through all of them, but the ones regarding the symmetric key encryption we'll mention now. These are the things that we'll use, and you should remember and understand these assumptions and principles as we go through this cryptographic course. So, some notation. With symmetric key encryption, we use the same secret key, we denote as K, both the encryptor and decryptor. So that key is used for encryption and decryption. If A is communicating with B, let's say we say there's user A and user B, then we'll often write the key as K subscript AB. We can draw that. We have two users. User A wants to communicate with user B. Then we have some plain text, denote P1. We encrypt. We use an encryption function, and that function takes the plain text, P1, and a key, and we'll often write that as KAB, meaning it's a key known by A, known by B as well, shared between A and B. As the output, we get some ciphertext, and that ciphertext is sent to B. So this is our normal model for encryption. We decrypt using the decryption function, and importantly, in the normal case, the ciphertext should be decrypted with the same key that was used for encryption if we want to get the original plain text. So the notation so far, two users share a secret key, we'll denote that as KAB. If user C knows KAB, then it's not a secret and our system fails. Okay, so we'll assume no one else knows KAB. If user A wants to communicate with user D, they would have a different shared secret key, KAD. Okay, so each pair of users in a system would have a shared secret key. We can write it as a function. When we encrypt our plain text P with a key, we produce the ciphertext. So this is just describing what we do. Now the next two are important, and we'll use them throughout the course. We assume when we decrypt the ciphertext using the correct key, we will produce the original plain text. What is the correct key? What do I mean by correct key here? If we encrypt the plain text with one key, KAB, the correct key is also KAB. The correct key in symmetric key encryption is the key that was used to encrypt. In other words, if we encrypt the plain text with one key, if we decrypt the ciphertext with the same key, we'll get the original plain text back. That's our assumption. It will always produce the original plain text, and that's how the algorithms are designed. The next sentence is also important. We'll assume that the person doing the decryption, when they decrypt the ciphertext with a key and they get some plain text as output, we'll assume that they can recognize that that plain text is indeed correct. They know that they have got the correct plain text out. And there are ways to do that in practice, but we'll assume that that's always the case. And as a result, we'll assume that they therefore know that the key that they used is correct. We'll finish with one example. We'll have time. If I decrypt using KAB with the ciphertext C and get some plain text, if that ciphertext was obtained by encrypting with KAB, then the plain text we get out here is the correct one, and the key that we used is the correct one. And that will become useful for authentication. From the other perspective, when we're decrypting ciphertext, if we decrypt using the wrong key, that is, the plain text was encrypted with KAB, I try to decrypt it with KAX, not the same key, If I decrypt with the wrong key, then we'll assume that the plain text that comes out is of course not the original one, and that we will recognize that it's not the original one. We will decrypt if we use the wrong key, the one that doesn't match that was used for encryption. We'll get plain text out which doesn't match the original plain text, and I will know that. And therefore I know that the key I used is wrong. So the decryption in practice produces unrecognizable output, random looking output, which we know is wrong. So this is an important assumption, or the last two are important assumptions for how we use encryption for confidentiality, but also later for authentication. It requires a bit of thought to get your head around that logic. I suggest you do that over the next 24 hours or so. Tomorrow we'll look at an example to summarize that and move on to the other aspects of encryption. Where do we get to? Authentication will be the next thing that we look at. All right, we'll look at that tomorrow. Let's stop there.